Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to today's Cornerstone webinar. My name is Justin Goddard, and I serve as Senior Program Officer for National Leadership in Education here at Community Progress. Cornerstone is our webinar series, which equips participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. For today's Cornerstone, we are joined by Brian Larkin. Brian Larkin is Director of the National Land Bank Network here at the Center for Community Progress. As Director of the network, Larkin leads programming, research, and education to support America's 200+ land banks, governmental entities that acquire, maintain, and transfer vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties, and work to create assets for neighbors and neighborhoods. Before turning it over to Brian, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have a question during the presentation, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your webinar browser and type your question into the Q&A box. We will share presentation slides and a video recording of today's presentation in the week following. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send us a message by clicking on the chat icon at the bottom of the browser or by sending an email to myself at jgoddard@communityprogress.net. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Brian.
Thank you for that, Justin. And now I will pull up my screen. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm looking forward to the opportunity today to share some information on behalf of the National Land Bank Network. Now, as we get started, I want to do a couple of things. First, I'm going to start with, we'll have two quick polling questions to kind of get a feel for who's in the room right now and who's participating. And so I'll put the first one up on the screen right now, which should be up now. And as you're filling that out, we'll briefly share the results in a minute. I want to set the stage for what today's discussion is going to be about. So this isn't a land banking 101 discussion. So if you've come here today and you're trying to figure out how to get a land bank started in your community or the ins and outs of operating a land banks, Center for Community Progress has experts who speak on that and have spoken on that in our previous webinars, and there's information available. I am not one of those experts. What I'm going to talk about today is what we're finding out about what's going on with the nation's land banks. I'll give a little bit of background and context and provide for that. But the meat of what we'll hear today is kind of what we've seen in some of our early surveys, how the National Land Bank Network is being shaped by the needs of land bank leaders, and what we can have from there. So it's looked like we have a decent amount. We have 145. We've got about 90% participation in the poll. So it's been a minute, and I'll go ahead and stop it now and share the results so we can see. So it looks like, thankfully, nobody tried to cash their check. And I will tell you that first answer, while it may come across as funny, as I get into talking about myself, I started my career off as a LISC AmeriCorps intern at the Genesee County Land Bank in Flint, Michigan. And one of the first things I did as the intern was work the front desk. And I would tell you, in 2006, it was not an uncommon occurrence for someone to walk in and try to cash their check at a land bank. And so what we have here, though, is we see that 72% of the people who are listening today are familiar with it, and 21 people need to be giving this presentation instead of myself, as they identify as gurus. So we'll go ahead and get started on the presentation. So what we going to talk about today is not about what land banks are in their essence, but how land bank and the field of land banking is growing and where there are opportunities and what's going on today. The image that you see here, I like to share because I think it represents some of the best of what could occur with land banking, where we're taking spaces, taking vacant, abandoned, or deteriorated property and turning it into a catalyst for a community. This image that you see here are images that represent individuals who occupy that adjacent community in Kalamazoo, Michigan here. This partnership also represents the best of what we see with land banks is when they're partnering with their communities to bring forth results. And so we'll highlight throughout this discussion some of those other results as well. So as I mentioned, myself here, I'm Brian Larkin. I serve as the director of the National Land Bank Network here at the Center for Community Progress. I've been in this role since the beginning of January, as the National Land Bank Network is brand new. We began and rolled this network out in 2020. I was excited to join this work. I come to this work from a background in public municipal office. I've worked as a planning director and also a chief of staff to a mayor. I've worked in philanthropy, funding a lot of the work that goes on in community development. And also I've worked directly in nonprofits, beginning my work in land banking, but also working around vacant space management, different activities with vacant space. So I bring that full suite of experiences to really try and understand how our land banks throughout the community can work within these spaces, can work to attract the resources needed, can accomplish the goals, and can really help further our communities and help in their revitalization. So at this time, I'll bring up our second poll, which is speaking about where we are. So we understood who is on the call today. So now I would like to know where you guys are in proximity to land banks. And so really briefly, if you could identify whether or not you have an active land bank where you are located. All right, answers are coming in pretty quick, and we're around 90% already. I'll go ahead and stop and share the results. So the majority of people are located in areas with land banks. That's important because when we're talking about some of the activities that are going on, you can understand if you see something that's inspiring or want to share, you know where to share that with. For those of you who are in communities that they're sure are not serviced by land banks, there are other resources that we have at the Center for Community Progress that help to understand if land banking is a solution that makes sense for your community. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So really briefly, what we'll talk about today are the governmental entities or nonprofit corporations that are focused on the conversion of vacant, abandoned, and tax delinquent properties. There's a lot of different conversations around land banking, and there's terminology. There's land banking programs that occur in certain places, and sometimes there's work dealing with conservation. In this conversation today, exclusively talking about the entities that are looking to convert vacant and abandoned tax properties into productive use. So thinking about the field of land banking, since 2000, we've seen a huge growth in the amount of land banks that exist throughout the country. We're over 250 today. At that time, we've seen over 200 more increasing since then. States have various forms of enabling legislation, from comprehensive states that provide full suite of tools and resources, and even one state that provides financing for land banks, down to other states that are really in the early phases of that. And what we're looking at with this National Land Bank Network is understanding how your states are positioning these states are positioning these land banks to be successful. In some cases, we've seen the economic impact of upwards hundreds of millions of dollars, like we've seen in Ohio, where we've seen certain land banks have individual programs that have vast impacts in beautification and increasing community gardens, or in overall property acquisition that we've seen in the state of New York. A lot of this is made possible, and this is so important, the work that land banks do, begin and end with the state enabling legislation and the tools that you provide. And what we like to promote is that with the appropriate legislation, land banks can be an amazingly productive and useful tool. And in some of the other places, we're working our ways to get there. And hopefully some of the things that we're hearing today will highlight to some of our states why that land banking can be a successful tool, and that more is even needed to occur where we have it already. So in trying to understand the impact of systemic vacancy, what we wanted to do today was look at specifically at land banks and our interventions. And the purpose of land bank interventions are not just because there is inherent value in land banking, it's because they're operating in communities that have received extensive amounts of disinvestment, decline, and we know that that disinvestment and decline is not distributed equitably. So there are many places that are experiencing inequities, and we need to figure out ways that land banking as a tool to support that. So for the National Land Bank Network's perspective, our first thought is, well, let's understand where our land banks are. So we rolled out a National Land Bank Network survey that was sent out to land banks throughout the country this year. We received responses between March and May of 2021. And what we're going to go over today is what we heard. But first, I want to start with who responded. We received responses from states all throughout the country that have land banking. We received responses from states that have multiple, up to 50 and 60 different land banks, and to some states where there's only 1 or 2 land banks. So we received various scales, large and small, urban and rural. And when we go in today, the results that we received in this survey, I feel are responsive of the community. I want to put out a disclaimer. These are not going through a statistical analysis of significance to say, okay, this is exactly representative of the field as a whole. But I feel confident in what we're sharing is reflective of a vast array of various sizes, capacities of land banks throughout the country. The chart that you see on the right breaks down the type of land bank. And so as I mentioned earlier, we have state enabling legislation that provides kind of what your land banks can do, but where do your land banks represent? And so over half of the land banks that responded to the survey are at the county level. And then you will see that about roughly a third or a little less than a third at the municipal level. We're showing more and more increases in others that are municipal, multi-municipal, state and regional, and there are opportunities for growth there, but the vast majority are at the county and city level. So what do we hear? Well, as I mentioned before, we got land banks of all different sizes in different locales. The majority of land banks are representing urban areas. And so what this chart on the left is saying, it's not saying the number of parcels. So don't read this and think that 64% of all land bank properties are urban. What it's saying is 64% of the land banks are saying that the majority of their properties are located in urban areas. While that is a large percentage, what is equally important, over a quarter of land banks are telling us that the majority of their property are in rural areas. Why is this important? When we're looking at strategies to support the resources, to support the capacity of land banks, we've got to be cognizant of tools that are successful in urban areas, tools that are also successful in rural areas. And so some of the upcoming legislation and things we'll touch on later reflect just that there is a large proponent of the land banking community that is serviced outside of urban areas, even though we represent a majority in urban areas. What we pulled out anecdotally from the survey, 53% of respondents stated they don't have adequate funding to cover basic expenses. Of note, this question isn't saying, do you have enough funding to do everything you'd like to do, to engage in all the programs and do all the cool things that you've heard that land banks can do? No, this is saying to do the basic functions, keeping the lights on, doing the operations, do you currently have enough funding? And over half do not. 47% have a staff of 1 full-time equivalent or less. What does that mean? That means that they are bogged down, or not bogged down, that they are focused primarily on the essential day-to-day activities. So when we're talking about some of these advanced strategies, some of these equitable development ideas, and some of these really innovative designs, they aren't able to devote the time to that, even if there's a great desire. So the National Land Bank Network is recognizing that there is a need to gather these best practices to help make it more possible and to attract resources that can help expand the capacity of land banks and all the work that they're doing. All land banks expressed that they were engaged in some form of basic property maintenance, but there was a great desire to expand into new activities such as new development, construction, and rehabilitation of structures. So when we mentioned that 53% of land banks don't have adequate funding to cover basic expenses, one of the responses to that has been, how can we identify federal resources made available? This is not to short the importance of what happens at that state level. And don't forget, we led off with that at the beginning. It is very, very important, and ways that land banks can engage in supporting their state level, at their advocacy at the state level, is really, really important. From this national conversation level, though, there's been virtually nothing done on the national level prior to some of the work that's going on right now to advocate for the field of land banking as a whole. And so what have we seen in response to answer this question of how we can provide adequate funding for basic expenses? Well, previously there was introduced the National Land Bank Network Act. There was a bill that looked at providing technical assistance opportunities for land banks. If you recall, previously we stated almost half of land banks have low staffing numbers, and so technical assistance can provide the increases that they need. What we have currently introduced in this session of Congress is the Restoring Communities Left Behind Act, which is a competitive grant opportunity of $5 billion annually, of which land banks are explicitly eligible to engage in. What's so important about this is when we're thinking about creative ways or the opportunities that could be catalysts in your community, land banks are eligible to apply for these, but also encouraged to partner and be a part of the conversation and be a part of the solution for your communities. And then the signed into act, the American Rescue Plan Act. Many individuals have heard about ARPA and recognize the trillions of dollars that are being sent out all over the country. Of a specific importance, though, that we've highlighted here are the $360 billion that are being sent, that have been sent or half already to all the states and all 19,000 municipalities across the country. The National League of Cities has estimated this is the first time that one single act will send resources to every municipality across the country. So that means every place that land banking is occurring and every community that has a land bank, they will also be receiving a surplus of funds right now. What we've encouraged the land banks to do in engaging in this, looking at what the responses we saw in the survey is to get involved in your conversations on the early end. The response hasn't been, hey, step in there and say, hey, give us money. It's how can the land bank be a part of our solutions? When we're thinking about some of the negative impacts we've seen in our communities, both during COVID and during our previous recession over a decade ago, some of those impacts take a really long time to be recognized. And with this surplus of funds, land banks can be at the forefront of preventing a lot of displacement, of increasing affordable housing access, keeping families in homes, which ultimately supports our economy and supports the communities in which we reside. So land banks, being a part of this conversation right now, could look at resources that are coming, that have already been signed into act, bills that have been introduced, and acts that could be introduced again as resources to help them accomplish some of their basic goals. So one of the other ideas mentioned was that land banks don't have the adequate staff. What we saw in there that technical assistance is needed to help land banks chart their future and state the value that they add to their communities. 50% of land banks stated in their survey that they don't have the data and software necessary to identify current and potential inventory. The graphic we see on the right is an example of a partnership that the National Technical Assistance Team at the Center for Community Progress had with the Blight Authority of Memphis. The reason I bring this specific example up is because this partnership occurred during the exact time that the survey was going on. So during that timeframe of 2021, we recognized working with an organization that had a strong leadership with a small staff, recognizing how can technical assistance help provide a way for these land banks to frame the message of the value they add to the communities. What we recognized in the community of Memphis was that they provided a great asset, but there was confusion locally about how best to partner, how best to utilize, and how best to leverage this. At the conclusion of this specific engagement, we saw through the National Technical Assistance Team here, in support of the amazing leadership in the Blight Authority of Memphis, that their city council was able to recognize the value that they had and allocated resources towards that. Technical assistance is needed throughout the field. The survey responses stated that there is a lot that individuals would like to do, and there's a lot that where they'd like to go as an organization to support their communities. But there is a need to understand, how do we best get there? And I think technical assistance, as we mentioned on the previous slide with the National Land Bank Network Act that was introduced previously and could be introduced again, but other resources that are needed in that space. So as the National Land Bank Network is getting up and running and up to speed, trying to identify ways to support additional technical assistance for our land banks, especially some of our smaller land banks that are getting started, so they can build a case and help the community understand all of the great things that can be accomplished. So when we're talking about understanding what land banks can do, the three big pieces that we wanted to understand how they're operating were how our land banks are acquiring properties, what they're doing once they have these properties, what activities, what end results, how are they transforming them, what investments they're able to make in them, and also what that costs. What does it cost to maintain these properties? How much are you spending? And where are we going from there? And then also at the end, taking to transfer properties to end use. So this talk today, we're in the early stages and giving you a sneak peek of what we're seeing in the surveys. We're still crunching the numbers on exactly what it looks like in the cost and investment. But anecdotally, what we can share is that for the essential maintenance of vacant lots, the range of what investment is occurring from organizations varies based on the inventory size of land banks. But from hundreds of dollars to thousands of dollars, each parcel in the inventory takes resources to transform and maintain it, and also to provide that input. And currently there are no dollars that are set aside that directly address that. And so land banks are being very creative with the ways in which they support this. They have resources that are traditionally coming from recurring governmental fees, from tax foreclosures and things of that nature, but then also individual appropriated dollars, fee for service, and development fees. A lot of the resources that they're right now using to acquire, to transform and maintain are coming from those. And so what is encouraging when we look at the importance and the emphasis placed on fee for service and developer fees, that is encouraging transfer as a way to keep the operations of land banks going. And one of the challenges there is that land banks are an amazing resource in being mission-based, and we don't want that burden of revenue to really get pushed towards creating the deal at the highest return possible, because land banks have this unique ability that they can be responsive to their communities. They can be responsive to their boards and to their representatives and help provide these results that are of the greatest asset to the community, not just for the end piece. As we spoke about this development here, in many communities recognize that demolition of, when we're talking about these vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated structures, sometimes is the best thing that can occur. However, that's not the only thing that are occurring on land bank sites. There is a huge investment and huge impact that we're seeing from demolition, and studies have shown the increase in property value of adjacent properties when demolition occurs. But beyond just that, we're seeing maintenance that's occurring on our existing properties, getting it ready. There's vacant lot reuse. Several respondents focused on the fact that job creation is occurring, that they're hiring and engaging in workforce programs or partnering with local workforce programs to provide credentials and trainings and basic skills that are necessary by doing work on their properties. We're seeing foreclosure prevention to work on the front end to keep families in homes, partnering with their county treasurers and trustees, to engage in trainings for individuals where you're seeing property taxes falling behind. And ultimately, the piece at the end that did you see at the end of the slide where land banks express the greatest interest and desire is how to engage more in rehabilitation, new construction, and ultimately increasing the stock of quality affordable housing in their communities. So I want to take time right here to do our last poll. So I'm going to pop it up on the screen right now, and this one is a quiz. So we're going to see. The question here is, what is the median number of properties of land banks have in their inventories? So, and this is again based on the survey. Land banks were responded to this question to tell us how many properties do you currently have in your inventory. The question here is saying, what is that median number for land banks throughout the country? So I'll allow a little bit of time for individuals to respond. Also, I'll take this time to note, please feel free to start using the Q&A. As I get towards the end of this, I really want to leave time for robust discussion and back and forth with Q&A. So as I'm going through here, please use this time to provide questions in the Q&A. All right, we've got about 72% of people responding. Seems like we've got a couple people stumped. I'm gonna provide a couple more seconds. Jeopardy music, anyone? All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll. So the number one response was that land banks on average have roughly, I'm sorry, I'm not sharing it. My apologies. The number one response was that land banks have roughly 50 to 100 properties in their inventory. 39% of people guessed that. 30% guessed less than 50, with 17% 500 and 1,000. And I'm gonna pull up the next slide right now, which will provide you with the answer. So the answer is actually 40. So for the individuals who responded less than 50. The median number of properties in inventories of land banks are 40 properties. However, the mean or the average is 1,887. Now, that's represented by the reason where I'm highlighting this on this slide here is to let you know that land banks vary greatly throughout the country. We have a large concentration in the number of land banks in Michigan and Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. We also see in those same communities in Michigan, Ohio specifically, the size of land banks where they have really, really large inventories. However, the vast majority of land banks are smaller organizations. They're dealing with the handful of properties that they can get their hands around. But also, if you go back to the pieces that I mentioned earlier, without a dedicated revenue source, without clear understanding of how you're going to make this work, and a push towards engaging in deals that pencil out, land banks aren't encouraged or incentivized to increase their inventory. And so when you take out some of our largest land banks, which we see in Michigan and Ohio, if you take out those numbers, we're seeing a lot smaller. And we have in the thousands of properties there, but most land banks are not in that thousands of properties. We're seeing a lot larger, a lot smaller here. And then the bar chart to the right identifies the breakdown. And so this bar chart you see to the right is the responses that we got on the survey, excluding some of our really largest responses. What's important here is 87% of properties that are in the inventory of land banks right now are structure-free lots. 87%. So any interventions, any strategies that are going to occur that focus exclusively on building structures and what you can do with the structures is leaving out the vast majority of the inventory there. And I want to highlight another piece of work coming out of the Center for Community Progress here. And our vacant land reuse is launching an online resource center this fall. That is specifically for figuring out ways and innovative strategies and ideas to use on those vacant lots. This is going to be a huge asset to land banks when you recognize that their large portion of their inventory are vacant lots. And even so when we look at the fact that around 13% of the current inventory are structures, a portion of those structures are going to be demolished and become vacant lots. So when we're thinking about the impacts that land banks have on their communities, a lot of times we think about homes and property transfers, rehabilitation, and that's great. It definitely needs to occur. But if we're leaving out what we're doing with our vacant lots, how they're assisting, how we're being intentional about it, how they're not just something to kind of hold and sit and wait for something to be built on, but how they can actively be utilized in the re-envisioning of our communities, that opportunity exists now. And so I'm really excited for the online resource center that's going to come out in the fall, and we'll definitely share it with all our partners here. One of the things, as I mentioned before, that is unique about land banks is that they're mission-based organizations, and they can operate in non-traditional real estate roles. What we heard from their responses is the vast majority are selling their properties for less than fair market value. And also, land banks are prioritizing community residents as their number one recipient properties. When asked to prioritize and rank who they are selling properties to, community residents were number one, local nonprofits were number two, and local LLCs and private entities were number three. This is important when we're thinking about the context of what some of the challenges we're seeing in some of our emerging markets. So when you're thinking of real estate markets in places that are viable places or on the upswing or desired or the next best place to go to, one of the big concerns that we've heard from communities is how to keep properties or keep the benefit of properties benefiting those who are in the communities already. There are some concerns with speculation, with out of region buyers, with people who aren't investing and going to fix up those properties. Land banks right here are showing you when properties are in their inventory, they have a hands-on approach to making sure they're transferred within the communities when they can, when there's an opportunity. And so that is a huge resource. And we're thinking about advocating against some of those federal conversations and your state conversations as well about why resources within the land banks are valuable. It's more than just how much can you sell this property for, how quickly can you turn this around? It's how can you help bring up the community with the community and have the community be a part of this revitalization. One of the other pieces that came through loud and clear in the survey was that land bank leaders are increasingly expressing interest in deepening their commitment to racial equity. Nearly all the land banks leaders who responded to the survey and said that they felt like their racial composition of their staff or their board didn't match the community they served, nearly all of them expressed interest in learning ways to increase this diversity. Also, there was anecdotal mentions and quantitative mentions of wanting to be connected to strategies to engage in equitable development and property transfer that highlighted ways in which that these land banks can be equitable with their property transfers, and also how they can understand the context in which they're operating in, whether it's the historic context that provided the lower depressed market values that they're experiencing right now, or some of the current context and market pressures that are working against or for the individuals in the communities. It is no surprise that a lot of the communities that have large portions of land bank properties are those same communities that have been historically redlined. There's research going on by land banks throughout the country that is looking at the overlap between the inventories they have right now and the banking practices that have occurred historically and the lack of investment in communities of color, predominantly African-American communities. Land banks now sit in a situation to which they can directly respond to that. Land has power, they have access to this land, and they're interested and engaged. The survey has told to us and to the network that we have a prime community that's interested and ready to be engaging in solutions that are equitable. And so we highlighted some of the challenges, we highlighted some where they're going on, but I want to identify a couple of success stories really quick, really briefly before I jump into the end of what's happening with the National Land Bank Network. So three stories that are three communities that I wanted to highlight and share that come to mind are Atlanta, Detroit, and Albany. In Atlanta, they recently launched a program to take land that it owns and convert it into affordable housing. This is in partnership with the city of Atlanta and the Metro Atlanta Land Bank are working together to accomplish this goal. The land bank will help build the single family homes and then sell, focusing primarily in Southwest Atlanta. This is an amazing opportunity where we're looking at an existing resource that can then be transferred into the ownership of families. In Detroit, the Rehabbed and Ready program stabilized the Detroit neighborhoods by replacing vacant properties with homes ready for purchase on the traditional real estate market. These purchases strengthen neighborhood housing markets, restore home equity, and make it easier for future home buyers to access financing. Here, we're looking at examples of working with the traditional financing market and getting these things revitalized and back and ready to go. And then in Albany, the example of the Albany Land Bank is partnering with the regional CDFI to provide financing for first-time buyers and small local investors to purchase and rehab land bank homes. So when you look at these suite of activities, we're looking at land banks making sure that individuals can connect to those financings, that inventory is ready, that they could want to move into, and that where those connections can be made, connecting existing inventory, traditional financing, and buyers, we're putting all those places. What we see through all three of these examples will be strengthened communities based on the land bank's involvement in driving that forward. We really want to applaud the great work they're going on, specifically in these land banks in this example, but in all the land banks throughout the country. So the future of land banks and land banking. As I mentioned, the National Land Bank Network is rolling out this year, and it's been in response to a lot of what we've heard here and a lot of what we've seen in our survey. So the National Land Bank Network is focused on the development and management network, but also that technical assistance piece that we heard loud and clear is needed, the federal advocacy work that's needed at the national level, and that vacant land reuse. The survey reflects all of these pieces. When we've heard land banks say that they're understaffed, they're under-resourced, and they have huge inventories of vacant land. This National Land Bank Network is shaped exactly by the shape of what land banks are and how they're functioning. And so as we'd like to roll out this fall, this is my time to formally announce the National Land Bank Conference will be occurring on November 3rd. It'll be a virtual conference, and we'll have a virtual software app that's used. And there'll be a formal announcement coming out through email. Everyone who's participated and signed up for this Cornerstone webinar will receive in the mail when the registration becomes available. But I wanted to give you a chance now to be aware of it, that it's happening. It'll be a half-day conference on November 3rd. Here, we're going to roll out our membership model. The National Land Bank Network website will be ready to preview, but most importantly, we'll be able to share the stories and the exciting things that land banks are going on from land banks. You'll be able to hear firsthand some of the great examples and models, see stories and tutorials, and hear from dynamic speakers across the country about the work that land banking is doing in communities. In partnership with that, the next day, the National Land Bank Network will be hosting a land bank leader training session. We'll do a half-day training session, training the land bank leaders throughout the country on the essentials of running a nonprofit, how land banking fits within that context, looking at how we're managing with our board of directors, organizational structures, financing, and inventory. So on that first day, we're going to champion and tell the story of all the successes. And then on the next day, with the targeted group of land bank leaders, we're going to start engaging in that work and understanding exactly where those support's needed. As we mentioned, we have various capacity and sizes and scopes. And so we're figuring out a way to bring all of that together. Some of our more advanced land banks, we're going to be calling on to lead sessions and bring others along. But some of our newer ones can talk about the innovative strategies and ideas and things that they're working on in their context. So the National Land Bank Network is really, really excited to get started. We're excited to roll off, and we're looking forward to an outstanding conference. Hopefully, all of you are available to attend. Again, both of these will be virtual. Information will be sent out later on in the year when registration begins. But I wanted to take the time to give you guys a sneak peek on some of the things that the National Land Bank Network is thinking about and looking to make a splash in the community. And so with that being said, I've reached the conclusion of my presentation, and I'm going to open up the Q&A. I'll ask Justin to come back to get us started, and then we'll go back from there.
All right, so I'm just going to tee off the Q&A portion of today's presentation. And the first question that I'm going to pull is one that reads, how many land banks were formed using NSP funds? And does this federal funding create more problems versus ability to redevelop?
That's a good question. And so while we don't have in the survey the exact number of land banks specifically and how they originated in their funding, those are things we can get more context to. However, the second piece of that, federal funding create more problems versus the ability to redevelopment. Federal dollars come with challenges and opportunities. We recognize that resources are needed in order to accomplish our goals. At the same time, there's accountability. And I think the challenge isn't that the funds are so challenging. And we've seen successful NSP programs, and we've seen challenging ones. I mean, we'll be honest here. There are many individuals on this call right now, if they were given the platform, could share the heartache and the heartburn they received in administering the NSP program, whether it was within their land bank or other places. Also, there are many individuals who are living in communities in homes right now because of those funds. So it is a challenge. It's a bit of both. What I can say, though, when we're talking about federal funding, whether it's NSP or something being reintroduced in the future, whether it's National Land Bank Network Act, the Restoring Community Left Behind Act that was mentioned, or anything else, is that putting systems in place are what's going to prevent some of those challenges, and also be able to communicate back to what are the challenges that are built in the system. Because sometimes The challenges are in the requirements and the expectations when the federal funding source doesn't understand how land banks function and how they operate. And if we have good systems in place, we can help communicate that. But other times, the challenges are in not being able to account for expectations, not being able to track, and not being able to move forward. We've seen using in some of our community the Troubled Asset Relief Program. And so, and issues there, and there's challenges with the Special Inspector General. The real piece, though, is that the resources are needed. How can we put the systems in place? And the National Land Bank Network has taken time. We recently held a conversation to understand what were some of the lessons learned through the SIG TARP process that I mentioned of the Troubled Asset Relief Program. How can we build from there and how can we grow? Because at no point in time do we want to say, hey, that money's not worth it and those federal resources, because they're really responsible. I mean, we're looking at public resources aligned to support public property and quasi-public governmental institutions. We still want to definitely encourage that. So as we're looking through the pieces, see question about one of the first ones is how are land bank properties acquired and sold? And I think this is a great one to touch on. I didn't get into the full detail, and I know in some of our land banking one-on-ones they can get into more of the bits and pieces of it. When we're talking about land banking here, of course, it varies from state to state and kind of where you are, but the real tool that we are promoting and saying is a great tool is the delinquent tax foreclosed system. So when you're looking at your foreclosure, how your property taxes and your foreclosing process, land banks that have the ability to intervene in that process, whether it's to preemptively purchase properties that are going for sale that have been foreclosed, whether it's to purchase them based on a credit sale. So saying, hey, we're going to do this work in the future, and we want that work that we're going to invest in there to count towards the sale. There are special powers in certain communities that land banks have to enter into that tax foreclosure process. When you're looking at a pro forma or how you control for the cost, being able to engage in that process is really where we see the greatest value. Communities that have an issue with blighted property that are going through the tax foreclosure system is where land banks really have a healthy pipeline of properties that are coming through. So moving along in the questions, we see about individuals. There's some concern in certain communities about individuals wanting to reach out with their land banks. And so we'll have my contact information is here as the network tries to work really closely with most of the needed, with most of the land banks throughout the country. If you reach out, we'll do our best to get you in direct contact. We work with all of the communities that I explicitly mentioned today. We recognize that a lot of that is going on. And so we see that we'll try to connect you in that piece. Another question that I have right here, we see it says one of the many challenges startup land banks face is acquisition costs, but another is the administrative delay working with the locality and clearing the title. This can take months, this can take multiple months at a time. Ask, what are some of the suggestions to streamline the process? So again, this goes back to that piece of your pipeline. When you're looking at land banking, and again, I'll keep reemphasizing that, not speaking from this as a position as an expert in the space or even one that would directly provide technical assistance. But what we've seen in communities that have shown success, the greatest success occurs when you're able to when all of the invested parties in that process are able to sit down together. The Center for Community Progress looks at vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties and that whole system. They're looking at your code enforcement, they're looking at your foreclosure process and land banking. Here at the National Land Bank Network, we're really focused on that land banking piece, but for land banks to be successful, they need to get connected with all those other pieces. So if you have a county treasurer or a county trustee that's doing the foreclosing process, sitting down and wrapping out, making sure everyone's on the same page about, hey, what are the powers that this land bank has? How can they engage? What properties do you see coming forth? Most communities, the properties that are going forward through foreclosure and going forward through tax sale, or those pieces are laid out well in advance. And so if you can get on the same page with that entity, and it's the same with your code enforcement, when you're seeing multiple code violations stacking up, if you all can get together and say, okay, hey, here are the properties that we're looking, or here are the geographic areas. How many properties are frequently code-offensive violators and are on their trajectory to getting tax foreclosed? How many are behind on their taxes? And you're saying this. Looking at your communities, do you see you have a stake where the bulk of available properties for foreclosure are going through the sale, or is it just a small percentage of them? That's where you're able to get into that conversation and understand and say, hey, these are the processes we'd like to do. What's the timeline? How do we build out a timeline? What are those costs associated? And so that's where we've seen the greatest success in certain communities that they express that ways, but I'm sure it all varies based on how involved each of those pieces are in your place. So another question about specifically about the survey was saying, is the majority of the 80% vacant lots from demolition done by the entity? And while we didn't get into the context there, I would say that it varies. It varies in your communities. You have some communities that have engaged in extensive amounts of demolition. When we saw the example, or when I mentioned the example of what happened with the Troubled Asset Relief Program and the hardest hit funds that were allowed to be used for demolition, we saw a huge upgrade, millions of dollars of demolition occurring. So in a lot of those places, those direct entities that received the funds for demolition were able to engage in that. Without any resources to do demolition, any outside resources dedicated from that, whether it's from a municipality or city, we won't see a lot of examples of land banks doing the demolition. So if you're looking in places where they didn't receive a lot of resources for demolition, the vast majority of the vacant lots in their inventory would most likely have been done in advance of receiving that. So it varies based on place, but you're seeing in a lot of places when they received an influx of federal resources to engage in that demolition work, then that's happening. Because it's very rare to be able to do that demolition, or if they're contracting with the city or the municipal or their county or theirs are contracting with their land bank to do their demolition for them, then you'll see cases where that is occurring. Moving on to the next question we see here. The question that says, gap funding is a huge need to develop the vacant land, and it's good to hear that some legislation is being worked through. Are there any further info on the time frame about what's going to happen with that? So I'm sure our Director of Policy, Rob Finn, is on here and would be able to provide a much more informed answer. But what I can say is right now is a prime opportunity where individuals who are interested in this sort of work, where legislators who are trying to pass these sort of bills are all in conversations together because they see a window of opportunity now. There's a lot of talk around what could happen, what could possibly happen in the federal infrastructure bill. And people are speculating in various ways of, oh, could we get some of this in there? Could we get some of that in there? And now's the time where we're keeping our eyes on it. As we mentioned, the Restoring Community Left Behind bill has been introduced. There's other acts that help with gap funding, such as the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which is a looking at 80% to 120% AMI for single family development, tax credits for those gaps there. That has been in the conversation. So right now is a prime time to keep an eye on it. I would say keep an eye on the things now. But what happens is really up to kind of the federal process. If I could tell you at the speed at which something is going to happen in Congress, I think my boss would probably owe me a raise. So moving forward. So there's a specific question from an individual about some of those specific examples that we had in Albany and Atlanta and Detroit. And I'll follow up with the answer afterwards. I'll send answers. I'll get the direct individuals from those places to provide those answers about what's going on. Here's a question about, are we providing training for government-run land banks similar to ones with nonprofits? So early on, as we're getting started, we're branching a wide net. We're providing opportunities for all land bank leaders to participate. So when we have this session that's going to be on November 4th, if you're running a land bank, whether it's a part of your municipality, part of your county, or your quasi-governmental ones that we've laid out here, you're welcome to participate and see what's beneficial in that space. As we gain a better understanding of who wants to participate in the network and what those needs are, we'll be able to better grow and support that. What is important, though, is the National Land Bank Network is really going to be focused on supporting the land banks that are taking these vacant, abandoned, deteriorated properties and trying to realize solutions to revitalize those properties. So if you're engaged in that work and you're doing land banking, we're participate early on, and we'll try to figure out ways to help shape what you see there. A lot of great questions here. Looking at the time, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to get to all of them before Justin kicks me off. So I'm going to try to pull up about 3 more. One says right here, given that the vast majority of properties in land bank inventories are vacant lots, how are land banks managing property maintenance? This is a great question. And this was one that we asked directly. We asked all of our respondents directly how they are managing that. And the responses varied. Some were using, in those communities that I mentioned before that had the hardest hit funds dollars, they're using their and calculating the process of that demolition. In the previous question, someone asked me if the vacant land inventory was land that they demolished. In the cases when it is land that they demolished, they're allocating a portion of that demolition cost to be property maintenance for a subsequent number of years. In other cases, they're working with appropriated dollars from their counties and cities to try to allocate resources from there, but it is a challenge. It is one of the challenges. It is the reason that 53% of land banks state they don't have enough revenue to cover their basic expenses. The grass just keeps growing. The need is just there. And what it does in many communities where they have the choice, it prevents land banks from taking some of those risks, from acquiring some of those hardest challenges. And I think that undermines really the intent. The land banks aren't able to fully flourish and grow when they're having to be reticent. So right now it is a challenge. We hope that some of this push at the federal level and continue to push at the state level will be successful in farming that piece. One last finding I want to work with. There was a question about, do we working only with established land banks, or is there work being done with land banks in the process of being established? I wanted to take this time to highlight, separate from the National Land Bank Network, the Center for Community Progress has an initiative called the Land Bank Incubator Scholarship Program. And that is specifically for communities who think that land banking may be a strategy that is successful, that a strategy that they would like to adopt, or for land banks that, as I mentioned before at the beginning, while we have 25 states with legislation, they vary in their forms. If you think that your state legislation should be enhanced and could advance that forth, the Land Bank Incubator Scholarship Program is one that you should look into. So I would recommend anyone who's interested in that to look towards that. And I will take one more question. One is a comment. Someone mentioned the fact that infrastructure in rural communities is a huge issue. I'll respond to this comment by saying it wasn't mentioned in the Restoring Community Left Behind Act. That's the bill that's introduced, the competitive grant that land banks can apply for. There is a specific set aside of, it's a $5 billion bill, but a specific set aside for $500 million explicitly for rural communities. We are hearing you, we're hearing these challenges that are in space. And so that is there in that piece. And so the last example, the last question that I'm going to answer live, I'll pull up now and I'll allow Justin to start coming back. The last question is, has there been discussions to have a portion of municipal ARPA funds to go to land banks? Have there been examples? And so one of the first things that the National Land Bank Network has done is hosting some land bank leader conversations. And many of the individuals that we've spoken with are on this call today and could speak much more directly about how those calls have gone and what their involvement has been. We've spoke with land bank leaders, and the focus of several of the most recent ones have been specifically about the ARPA funds. While the funds will go to the municipalities. So they go to your counties, they'll go to your cities, they'll go to your townships, and the chief executive of those entities are the ones who are receiving them. In many communities, we're seeing examples of these executives putting together committees, working with their partners to understand how best to allocate these funds. So the piece about where the money can come from, because coming from the federal government, going to there. But then what can they do with those? we saw examples where states like Ohio and New York have talked about a desire to get some of the state dollars to really be dedicated towards, whether the example was in one of our first calls that mentioned in Ohio that there was an interest of having the governor allocate a portion, about millions of dollars, towards demolition. Upon hearing that, our land bank leaders in New York swiftly went back together to work together and have conversations about what they could do similar in their space. So again, when we're talking about the ARPA funds, there are funds going to the cities and counties, and then separate funds going to the state. But looking at the state pot of funds, how they approach that, the New York Land Bank Association was successful in working with the state, and ultimately Governor Cuomo allocated $25 million that could be eligible in various forms for land bank activities. And so this is going on right now. The one piece of advice that we can give is get involved, get engaged in your conversations now. If you haven't been in those conversations, it's not too late to be in there. Many communities are still trying to figure out. And also, these ARPA funds are coming down in multiple tranches. So half of the money has been received now. Another half is coming a year from now. Get involved in those conversations and help your communities understand how land banking is a tool to help accomplish the community goals. Get involved not with the goal of saying, hey, give us money because we need it. Say the community needs what we can provide, and these resources are a great opportunity to provide that. I apologize for not being able to get to all of the questions. I thank you all for your time, and I'll send it back to Justin.
All right. So I first just want to say thank you to Brian for giving really excellent, really informative presentation. And just quickly thank everybody who joined us today and asked a question and participated in the conversation. Please visit our website for more information on our webinars, on the National Land Bank Network, on all the other things that we're involved in as an organization. And with that, I am going to wish everyone a great afternoon. Bye, everybody.